buongiorno a tutti, sono Viviana Sudati del Polo della Cosmesi dove mi occupo di comunicazione e marketing. Quest'oggi siamo in compagnia dei nostri partner di Rodel Partners, in particolar modo con Giovanni Montanaro che è un avvocato partner e con Omar Sami, avvocato e direttamente da Dubai. L'argomento sarà proprio fare affari negli Emirati Arabi. Si tratta del terzo incontro inserito in un percorso che ha come tema l'internazionalizzazione, un tema che il Polo sta affrontando soprattutto nell'ultimo anno e mezzo, dopo l'ingresso nel progetto Global Cosmetic Cluster Europe, un progetto finanziato dall'Unione Europea e nel quale oltre al Polo della Cosmesi figurano altri 4 partner europei importanti, come ne cito 2, la Cosmetic Valley e il Beauty Cluster di Barcellona. Un progetto che ha proprio come scopo ultimo quello di aiutare e sostenere le piccole e medie imprese della cosmesi, ovviamente, nel approcciarsi a nuovi mercati, e uno di questi mercati target sono proprio gli Emirati Arabi. Direi di dare subito la parola a Giovanni per la sua parte, l'introduzione, e quindi seguirà l'intervento di Omar in lingua inglese, che entrerà proprio nello specifico di quello che è il panorama locale, insomma, degli Emirati Arabi, dando preziosi consigli e suggerimenti su come approcciarsi a questo mercato e quindi riuscire a fare affari in quell'area. Ci sentiamo più tardi, quindi ricordo di tenere i microfoni spenti, di tenere le domande per la fine, io poi scriverle in chat, io poi le rivolgerò ai nostri relatori. Buon ascolto, a dopo. Prego Giovanni.
Buongiorno a tutti, ringrazio innanzitutto Viviana, come Erika, come tutto lo staff che ci supporta sempre per questa, diciamo, ormai avventura dell'internazionalizzazione. Ci siamo già visti e confrontati ancora nel mese di giugno per darvi, diciamo, alcuni riscontri a livello generale su come affrontare i mercati. Ci pare molto interessante questo focus sugli Emirati, anche perché poi, appunto, facendo un po' diciamo, in conseguenza di quello che poi vi avevo detto anch'io ancora negli incontri di giugno, in cui non ricordo chi c'era o chi non c'era, ma forse qualcuno appunto se li ricorda, parliamo sempre poi ogni singolo mercato ha delle differenze e avendo, come dire, una certa pratica a livello internazionale come studio Rodel Partner, possiamo dirvi appunto che gli Emirati Arabi sono oggettivamente uno dei mercati più particolari al mondo, nel senso che quando vi si davano magari delle istruzioni, ecco, in questi giorni abbiamo un contratto di distribuzione che abbiamo fatto per un nostro cliente e di fatto quel contratto è valido un po' dappertutto nel mondo, anche se noi ogni volta che lui dice posso mandarlo in Argentina piuttosto che in America, ovviamente gli diciamo sarebbe meglio mandarlo ovviamente a un avvocato. Ci sono però dei paesi in cui è necessario, e Sami e Omar sorride perché insomma ne stiamo parlando proprio in questi giorni, è molto più necessario che in altri rivolgersi a dei consulenti. Quindi il punto da cui partire, ma che mi sembra anche sappiate già, visto che ci avete chiesto questo intervento specifico su questo mercato, è mercato ancora, nonostante la pandemia, nonostante tutto, dalle potenzialità enormi, mercato dalle regole molto complesse. Quindi oggi lo scopo del nostro incontro è fondamentalmente quello di darvi appunto alcune di queste regole. Dopodiché che cosa succede? Abbiamo il piacere di ospitare i nostri colleghi della nostra, diciamo, sede di Dubai, quindi c'è Omar e c'è anche Deria Bandak che è la responsabile dell'ufficio, quindi li vedete insieme. Omar è anche piuttosto prezioso perché nonostante oggi per timidezza non farà tutto l'intervento in italiano, in realtà l'italiano lo capisce, vedete che annuisce quando dico qualcosa di sensato, e quindi per quanto vi costringiamo oggi, diciamo, ad ascoltare un intervento in inglese, comunque accompagnato da delle slide e comunque, diciamo, insomma, abbastanza facilmente intellegibile, credo, insomma, trattandosi, come dire, di un linguaggio commerciale, sappiate che in qualche modo comunque le vostre domande arriveranno e in qualche modo verranno risposte. Peraltro, è presente sempre nel nostro studio anche Alina Samardina, la mia collega sempre dello studio italiano, in questo caso della sede di Padova, che avete già conosciuto anche lei perché è diciamo madrelingua russa e quindi si occupa principalmente dei mercati dell'Est Europa, ma in realtà si occupa poi anche di tutta l'internazionalizzazione, a cui darò, diciamo, dopo un'oretta, purtroppo sono impegnato in un altro convegno, il testimone, diciamo, per gestire la seconda parte di domande e tutto. Come vedrete poi, come sempre, saremo a disposizione, diciamo, in coda di questo evento, come in qualsiasi altro momento, per sostenervi, come per sostenere il Polo della Cosmesi, nella misura in cui abbiate delle eventuali domande specifiche. Da questo punto di vista, il nostro modello di Rodeln Partner è ovviamente affidarvi direttamente poi allo studio di riferimento, sapendo comunque che noi dall'Italia non scompariamo, nel senso che appunto molto spesso uno dei valori che diamo all'internazionalizzazione non solo è quello di avere molti partner in giro per il mondo come quelli che conoscerete oggi, che sicuramente hanno una competenza specifica di quei mercati, ma spesso a fianco di questo noi non è che scompariamo, nel senso che noi comunque rimaniamo un punto di riferimento importante per farvi da tramite, come dire, rispetto anche all'universo mondo. Quindi di fatto un modello che noi vediamo efficace nell'internazionalizzazione è quello di mostrarvi oggi anche i consulenti e la loro competenza, così sappiate direttamente con chi poi potete interfacciarvi, ma se volete anche rimanere un vostro punto di riferimento nella misura in cui, come dire, oggi come oggi l'internazionalizzazione spesso riguarda più mercati e quindi avere un punto di riferimento ancora in Italia può essere un valore aggiunto. Non aggiungo altro, appunto, se non che ringrazio particolarmente Omar ed Eria per il tempo che ci hanno dato, anche perché gli abbiamo dato poco preavviso per testare la loro efficienza e hanno confermato assolutamente velocemente e lascio proprio a loro la parola, ringraziandoli ancora appunto per la disponibilità.
Grazie Giovanni e grazie anche a Bibiana per l'introduzione. Cambierò in inglese adesso, I'll switch to English. And first of all, we would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to be part of this event and to have a presentation to give and show the opportunities on how to invest in the UAE. I will share now a slide or the slides and the agenda about the topics we are talking about today. Just give me a second.
So everybody can see the presentation, it's fine?
Yes, it's fine.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, perfect.
So yeah, just allow me to briefly introduce myself. My name is Omar Sami. I'm a German lawyer and a legal consultant. I'm working with Rödl & Partner in our Dubai office since now 6 years, and I'm responsible for the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So whenever the clients are planning to invest in one of these countries, I'm handling the client from A to Z at the end of the day. I'm also taking care of tax matters, especially in the UAE for value-added tax. And yeah, Delia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Also from my side, thank you very much for having us. I'm really sorry, I'm evidently the only one who's not Italian speaking, but I will try to do my very best to make it as easy as possible in English. My name is Delia Bandak. I'm from my background a German educated lawyer. I'm heading our Dubai office since now almost 8 years. So that means I'm based in the UAE actually since January 2014. I'm responsible for the activities of Rödl & Partner here in the UAE and in the GCC region, and mainly taking care of our clients related to commercial and labor matters, especially, of course, related to market entry strategies. We have, in the meanwhile, a quite proper team which are divided in tax consultants, legal consultants, and I will say a few words about Rödl & Partner Dubai also at the end of the presentation, but I would suggest that we start now with the hot topics.
Yeah. So this will be the agenda, what we are talking about today. So first of all, why should you or would you invest in the UAE? Then we'll go to discuss on how to invest in the UAE, what should be considered when entering the local market, because as Giovanni said initially, it's always mandatory to have a proper market entry due to the local circumstances. Yeah, so each country might have its own criteria and requirements on how to enter the market, and these of course should be considered in order to have a smooth process. We will briefly touch also the tax implications from a VAT perspective, and then discuss a couple of industries which from our point of view have great potential, had potential in the past and also in the future, of course. And yeah, so let's directly go into the topic. So why would you invest in the UAE? From our point of view, the UAE continuously shows enormous growth potential. And this is also reflected in the recently published data, for example, from the concerned government authority, the Department of Economic Development, where we could clearly see that the foreign investments are increasing in the UAE. Of course, there has been an impact during COVID-19 pandemic, definitely. I think this has been all over the world the same. But recently, and during the last month, we can see a significant increase of licenses of new companies being issued and investments coming into the country. The UAE has, from a legal perspective and tax perspective, definitely a quite investment-friendly climate, especially due to the fact that we have the concept of free zones. We have the new foreign direct investment law, what we are going to talk about also later on. And the UAE, and this is also what we have experienced over the last years, is that the government of the UAE is always trying to implement new projects, big projects in the UAE to bring opportunities to the country and therefore also to the companies located in the country. A good point is, a good aspect in terms of prices, that the Emirate of Dubai, unlike Abu Dhabi, for example, is not depending so much on oil. Yeah, so it's more Abu Dhabi than Dubai. Dubai is also focused a lot on tourism, for example.
Diversified, yeah.
And a diversified economy, exactly. One of the major points why we have so much investment coming to the country is, of course, the tax incentive in terms of there is no corporate income tax in the UAE.
So in general, investment project, what is really important is that they have to be planned carefully from the scratch. This is what Omar already mentioned, also our colleague Giovanni. It's important to have a clear idea about your strategy and also about your investment plans. It's important to know if you are entering the market, for example, for a short-term investment or project you have here in the UAE, or if you are considering a long-term investment, especially when you say you have an own setup. So we always recommend the clients that they at least have a 5 years plan in their mind how to proceed in the market in the UAE. If you have an own presence in the UAE, that means if you are not acting through distributors here in the UAE, then you can consider to have a mainland setup, an own presence in Dubai, for example. In this case, you always need to search carefully from the beginning for a local partner. This is quite crucial because this can lead later on, if you have the wrong partner, to some obstacles. We will go into the details of the local agency law later on. And the great exemption what we in the meanwhile have and the government introduced is the foreign direct investment law. So there are a lot of incentives related to foreign direct investments. In the meanwhile, also this topic will be discussed later on in detail. One part you always need to consider is, of course, that the UAE is a quite cost-intensive market. it would be not fair to not point out this topic. It's a cost-intensive market, so you need to know that your investment cost will be definitely a little bit higher than in other countries or maybe in Europe. You need to calculate your budget properly and carefully, especially related to rental payments, annual renewal of licenses, cost for visa applications, etc. And in the context of assignment of employees from the headquarters, especially when they are coming from Italy, of course, you need also to consider always tax aspects and aspects of social insurance in the home jurisdiction. I mean, we don't have personal income tax also in the UAE, but it's always important to review these topics from Italian perspectives, because you need to consider, for example, personal income tax in Italy and also social security payments in Italy. So this also needs to be calculated and reviewed carefully from the beginning. Establishing bank accounts can be a hassle. It's not if you have the right contacts, to be honest. I'm proud to say that we established a lot of contacts with different banks in the last years. So in this point, it's also really important that you have the proper contacts and guidance related to establishing your corporate bank accounts. So this also, the time frame actually needs to be considered, especially you can only establish bank accounts after you have already assigned for your license and received the license. After then, the bank account preparations can only begin.
Yeah, investing in the UAE. So here we are going to discuss on the various options on how you can enter the market. Here we can.
I'm in a call.
Yes.
Here we can distinguish between, or we should distinguish between, an own presence and a foreign presence. If you are deciding to enter the market with an own presence, there are several options to do so. One option can be to establish kind of a representation office. We call it the rep office, which from a legal perspective would be a legally dependent branch of a foreign company, so from the headquarter outside UAE. The representative office, they have a limited activity which can be conducted, which is limited to market observation, doing market research, entering or preparation of entering into contracts between the client in the UAE and the headquarter in Italy, for example. A limited customer service would be allowed under the representative office activity, but the customer service should be free of charge. So what you need to consider is that if you are having a representative office, you are not allowed to provide a service and receive monetary consideration for that. So you are not allowed to issue an invoice, for example, for these services under the representative office. A second option under the own presence would be a legally dependent branch of a foreign company with a different activity, basically with the same activity of the headquarter outside the UAE. This is crucial to understand that from a legal perspective, the branch of a foreign company is considered part of the headquarter outside the UAE. And as a consequence, the activity which can be conducted through the branch in the UAE must be exactly the activity which is done by the headquarter outside UAE. So if the mother company in Italy, for example, is providing, let's say, is selling or trading in shoes, then the branch is only allowed to trade in shoes and cannot go beyond that. A local agent for branch offices may be required with a foreign direct investment law, which has been implemented recently. Exceptionally, a local agent or service agent may be required, but there are some exemptions where you still need a local agent. Yeah? And the local agent in this case does not mean a local sponsor or a local shareholder, which is UAE national. It's more kind of an administrative support for your branch.
And I think in this regard, it's also worth mentioning, Omar, that a branch of a foreign company is also related to the tax depending on the mother company. That means due to the fact that the branch is a dependent part of the mother company, you cannot actually consider the tax incentives in the UAE. The branch will be charged with taxes exactly like the parent company, yeah?
Yeah, so that means that in case you are generating a kind of revenue through the branch in the UAE, most likely the Italian fiscal authority or tax authority would request you to tax this, the profit, yeah, under the Italian tax laws, most likely. One additional crucial point is that from a liability perspective, since the branch is considered a part of the headquarter, which is legally dependent of the headquarter outside UAE will be fully liable for any kind of violation or contractual breach or whatever, what is happening through the branch. So this is also one major aspect to be considered when choosing the right corporate form. And another option is the subsidiary. From a legal point of view, the subsidiary has its own legal personality and own legal capacity, so it's considered a separate entity from the headquarter. Generally, under the latest or under the previous commercial companies law in the UAE, the limited liability required a majority shareholding of a UAE national or UAE national company of 51%. An exception to this are the free zones. So if you set up a company in a free zone, you don't need a local majority shareholder, or if you are eligible to set up a company under the new foreign direct investment law. But we will cover this later on with separate slides.
I think also one more aspect you need to consider, because I know in many countries it's like to set up a rep office is quite easy and a quite fast procedure. In the UAE, if you consider to set up a rep office, you need to have in mind that the establishment procedure is actually similar to set up a branch of a foreign company. Yeah. Yeah. So you don't have any advantages related to the time frame, the documentation, and also related to the costs. So indeed, if we, from our experience the last years, we would say we are mainly setting up subsidiaries, less branches, almost none of representative office, because due to the fact that the establishment procedure is similar and also time consuming.
Yeah, exactly. From a cost perspective, from a time perspective, we do not see any difference in setting up either a rep office, a branch of a foreign company, or a limited liability company in form of a subsidiary. And since with a subsidiary you would be much more flexible when it comes to the activity, you would be more protected also from a liability perspective, because it's considered as a separate entity. So most of our clients decide to set up a separate legal entity in form of a limited liability company in the UAE. Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to the foreign presence, without setting up an own establishment in the UAE, an option would be to go into a distribution relationship with a local distributor, so with a company which is located in the UAE, to promote and market and to sell your products in the UAE and maybe also beyond the UAE, so in the whole GCC market. In Germany or Europe, in Italy, I believe it will be the same. There are various types of commercial agency agreements with slight differences and legal consequences. In the UAE, we have experienced that the distribution or the various distribution arrangements from a court perspective are in general considered as one agency agreement. So the UAE from a legal perspective, from a court perspective, does not make difference as we do, for example, in Germany or Italy. Yeah, when it comes to entering into an agency contract, what is crucial is always to consider or to have in mind the UAE agency law. The UAE agency law is very agency protective. It gives significant and comprehensive rights and protection to the local agent, provided that the local agent is either a UAE national as an individual person, or it is a company which is fully owned by a UAE national. In these cases, you always have to bear in mind that entering into an agreement with these kind of agents, the agent will be protected quite comprehensively, which we'll discuss also later on more in detail.
So this was the overview actually about the next topics. It's fine. So I will go into the preparation of the market entry. As we said before, due to the number of investment restrictions and specific regulations in the UAE, a really detailed and extensive preparation of the market entry is definitely crucial and mandatory. It's really comprehensive. If you do one mistake, especially related to the location of the future company, to change these post-establishment inaccuracies, especially they are really cost and time consuming. So therefore, you have to make an extensive review of the current situation, of your market entry strategy, and of your planned investment. For that reason, we always recommend our clients that they at least consider the following 4 steps, which we briefly mentioned. The first thing is to review if there is already a distribution relationship in place. Sounds easy, but we always or very often face the situation that, you know, the client had already 15 years ago, for example, already a distribution relationship in place, and then the management is changing, the responsible person is changing, and then suddenly you can consider market entry, and nobody knows at that time that there was a former distribution agreement in place. So what we do as a precautionary measure at the end of the day, that we check through the Ministry of Economy if there is a distribution agreement in place, if something is registered, just to make sure that the client will not face any obstacles later on when they set up their own company, especially related to customs issues, because the agent will be registered at the customs. This will be also in detail later on discussed by us, but just to bear in mind, checking if there is already a distribution relationship in place, then you need to define your strategy goals and your targets. We always recommend to have the targets and the goals in mind at least for the next 5 years, so a business plan related to the next 5 years, so a midterm business plan should be crucial. Definition of the correct location in the UAE. This is very important because once you set up your company here in the UAE, especially you go to a free zone and set up your company there in the free zone, and then after 6 months you realize, damn, I cannot perform some activities through the free zone company because simply it's not allowed to perform some sort of services, for example, outside of the free zone you are placed. Then you cannot just simply transfer your existing company to another free zone or into the mainland. The consequence would be to shut down the existing setup and open a completely new setup, or even open another branch of this company or a second establishment. So transferring of existing companies between free zones into the mainland is not possible because it's considered as different territory in the UAE. And then, of course, you need to check the legal background. You need to see what kind of corporate structure is suitable for us and what is actually possible under the legal framework. What kind of activities can I perform in the UAE with the corporate structure, and I choose. Can I do this within the free zone? Can I do this without the free zone? Can I do this within the GCC territory? This definitely needs to be defined to find your proper location with the exact necessary activities to don't have any crucial obstacles in the future.
Yeah. I would add only one more point. Even if you are intending to establish your company in the mainland of the UAE, it's always necessary to understand where you are going to have your main operational business, because technically you would need for each emirate where you are going to operate or trade your products, you would need a license from the concerned authority, technically. But practically, this is not, let's say, executed from the governmental side. Yeah. But however, it's always very important to understand where your main operational business will be, and to determine this as a hub for the UAE and apply the license accordingly in this emirate. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about the distribution partnerships. So before entering the market, and this is one of the levels we have, my colleague Deria has discussed before, it is important to understand if you have already certain relationships with a distributor in the market. Then if yes, if you answer this question with yes, then it might be a risk if the distributor is a UAE national or a company which is owned by a UAE national. And an additional important point is whether this distributionship is registered with the Ministry of Economy. So whenever your contract or your distribution agreement is registered with the Ministry of Economy in the UAE, then you may have the issue that the agency law, the commercial agency law of the UAE, would apply with a comprehensive protection of the agent. If this is not the case, so if the agreement, or let's say the distributor is not a UAE national or not a company which is owned by a UAE national, or the agreement is not registered with the Ministry of Economy, you are more free to negotiate, of course, and but always in compliance with the UAE civil and commercial law.
Yeah. In the next slide, we go a little bit also deeper into the, let me say, issues related to the commercial agency law. What is important to understand is, maybe I want to clarify this point. Going into an agreement with a local agent does not lead to this protection of the UAE agency law per se. Only if the UAE local agent registers this contract at the Ministry of Economy, then the UAE agency law applies, and then you have this issue with the extensive protection of the UAE agent. The problem is that the UAE agent, once you sign the contract with him, he's allowed to register the contract without your knowledge and without your approval. So that means he can do it and you don't even know it. So this is the reason why we say beforehand you need to be really careful related to this agreements and related to the terms and conditions of this agreement. As Omar said at the beginning, even if you mention in the headline of this contract that it's actually a franchise agreement or a trading contract, the UAE government and also the courts mainly consider this as commercial agency law, because only the commercial agency agreements are really known here in the UAE. The termination of such a contract is mostly ineffective. Let me say it like this. If you limit it, the time limit will not be considered because it's simply prohibited by law, and a subsequent non-renewal is also unjustified by law. The only reason the only justification of a termination would be through, in cases of like death of the agent, that the agent is distributing competing products of your company, that the agent is definitely not reaching any contractually fixed sales targets or harming the reputation of the company. I mean, we don't want to scare you too much. Yeah, we just want to point this out, that you are aware of the circumstances and that you are carefully assessing going into an agreement with a UAE national. Because simply it's difficult to get out of these contracts, and if you do so and terminate the contract without a justification, then you need to pay quite a high compensation. Yeah, we had cases where we had compensation payments which was a multiple of the annual earnings of the local company. So this is really difficult and needs to be considered carefully. What we always recommend is to review these contracts carefully, to put detailed targets in the contract, to review the targets, for example, in every 3 months, to sit together with the agent, define the targets, define if he reached the targets or not. If you do this properly, document this properly, then you are in a good position to prove, for example, a low performance, which indeed would be lead to justify termination of the contract. But as said before, this needs to be set up carefully and also monitored later on carefully by the principal.
In case, provided the UAE commercial agency law applies, from a legal perspective, the agent will be granted by law with exclusivity concern the territory and also the product, meaning that you are not allowed in general to import products without the commercial agent's support. The principal instead is not granted with exclusivity. So and in case, and this is also important, in case the principal is importing or trading goods in the country, in the agreed country and territory, without involving the agent in general is also entitled to a commission, yeah, on the products which have been imported and sold without his knowledge. In case of termination of the contract, unjustified termination of the contract, then, as Deria just mentioned, a quite high compensation may be determined by the courts. So this is also something what should be kept in mind. Contracts which are limited in terms of times do not expire automatically. So they renew by law, even though you have a fixed term in the contract. This is also very crucial when entering into a distributor agreement with a UAE national or a company which is owned by a UAE national. Yeah, as we have mentioned earlier, the UAE national or the agent is granted with full protection by law. One of the crucial points is whenever the agent is appointed, he will be registered with the custom, and only the agent will be allowed to import the products which are determined under your distribution agreement. What means that the agent, in case there is a dispute between you and the agent, can block your import or the import of your product, and basically also the whole market entry in the country, I would say. So this is one of the crucial or major points also which should be taken into consideration.
And this is the reason why we said from the beginning, if we think about a few slides before, where we said we recommend every company who is entering into the market to have this check at the end of the day at the Ministry of Economy if such an agreement is in place. I mean, this is something which can be done within 1-2 days. It's combined with low costs, but this is something you should definitely do if you are not really aware or doubt that there could be an agreement in place already.
Yeah.
So the next point is about corporations. So we have mostly the legal form of local limited liability companies in the UAE. Joint stock companies are also possible for FDI, for foreign direct investments, but rare in practice. Partnerships are generally not permitted under the foreign direct investment law. The incorporation procedure in the national territory, that means the mainland of the UAE, is taking a little bit longer mostly than in the free zones, but is also speeded up in the meanwhile. The only topic is that you would need a local majority shareholder who holds 51% of the shares of the company, and the time frame can definitely depend on how long the negotiations between the partners will take, because also a shareholders agreement needs to be in place in that regard, some side agreements. So this could take a little bit longer if you have, by law, more partners involved in the company setup. On the other hand, you can set up your company also in the free zone if it's applicable and makes sense by law related to your activities. The free zones are mainly well structured and really time efficient, and special requests can increase the formation time, especially if you need an NOC from further local authorities. In your area of activities might be, for example, if you want to trade some products into the UAE, that you will need additional approvals from the municipality. And I'm not sure, maybe even an NOC from the Ministry of Health could be applicable in some cases. Yeah, so that means even if you're setting up in the free zone and there is the licensing authority based, in special cases of importing products and special cases of health products, it might be that you need a few NOCs, which can take 2-3 weeks longer than planned from the beginning.
As Delia mentioned initially, the UAE has the concept of free zones and the concept of the mainland. So the free zones are, from a legal perspective, let's say autonomous governmental authorities which regulate the licensing of companies on their own without involving the authorities in the mainland of the UAE. What are the advantages or the pros and cons of a free zone company? In a free zone company, you don't need any local shareholder, so you don't need the majority shareholder as it might be necessary in the mainland of the UAE. You might have customs benefits when you enter or import your product in the free zones, where in most of the cases customs duty will not be applied. The free zones in general, they are very well structured, as Delia mentioned also previously, and you have also simplified visa procedures. So it is more, let's say, it's a smoother process to have new employees, even from outside the UAE, under your company in a free zone. Since there is no corporate income tax in the UAE, of course, there is no implication in that regard. However, VAT applies also in the free zones, for example, when it comes to the provision or rendering of services. For goods, it might be different. It depends on the specific free zone. But for services, in general, the normal VAT rules would apply. What are the cons of a free zone company? The free zone company is in general limited to the business in the free zone itself and business which is related to outside the UAE. So the whole world except the mainland of the UAE. For B2B, business. So if you have, for example, you have a company in the free zone, but you have a customer, B2B customer in the mainland, it's a gray area until now. So if if your customer in the mainland has an import license, normally the authorities, they do accept such business. However, B2C business from a free zone in the mainland is absolutely not allowed. Yeah. So this is something what you should definitely take into consideration when you choose or decide to establish a company. With regards to the costs, free zone companies are slightly higher than compared to the mainland. You have a limited flexibility in case you want to change the location from one free zone to another. However, if it's, for example, a change within a certain, under the umbrella of the headquarter of the free zone, within this free zone, it's possible, but from one free zone which belongs to a different authority, free zone authority, that would generally not be allowed.
So related to mainland entities, there are of course also some pros and cons. I mean, you can really benefit from the network of a local sponsor. So that means it not necessarily needs to be a silent local partner in each case. You can have also really an active local partner who has a wide network, and he can introduce a company, he can support you financially, and you can benefit also from management experiences he has, and of course from his wide network he has. So maybe you have in these cases an easier access into the market and speed up evolvement of your company in the UAE. That's definitely a benefit. There are no area restrictions in providing services or selling goods in the license in the Emirate where you are licensed. That means once you have a mainland company, you can provide services and trade within the whole UAE without any restriction. You have only rare restrictions in certain license activities, but this is only in case of oil and gas or manpower providers, which is, I think, not applicable here today. The cons are that you have the ownership of 51% of the local shareholder and 49% of the foreign shareholder. The impact of the local sponsor can be lowered by side agreements. That means certain agreements for next to the shareholder agreement, which is called side agreements, which are definitely in line with the UAE law, because otherwise it makes no sense, because otherwise they are unvalid by UAE law. So we are trying to draft these contracts in line with UAE law, but of course to the benefit of the foreign shareholder. So we can lower, as I said, the impact of the local shareholder, but certain rights he has to keep, definitely. Otherwise you will be in a really gray zone where you have the risk that your side agreement will be invalid. So in this case, again, it's really important to have the right local sponsor and to search for the local partner in advance of a setup, to have at least the knowledge of him, of his business mentality, and you cannot never be 100% secure. We are really honest with you, but at least you can make also your due diligence related to the partner in advance to avoid certain obstacles in the past, in the future, sorry.
Yeah. The good point is, which I would like to highlight, is that the UAE in 2018, they have announced and published the Foreign Direct Investment Law, which from its intention shall allow foreign companies to own 100% of the shares in a company which is established in the mainland of the UAE. So there has been a significant change over the last 1 and 2 years in the legal framework. The UAE have issued, just recently, to be honest, a couple of months ago, a positive list and a negative list, which reflect certain activities which are allowed under the foreign direct investment law, so which can be conducted by foreigners which own 100% in the company. I believe it's more than 1,000 activities on the positive list which are eligible to foreign investors. So this is going from service, provision of services, over trading of products, manufacturing. So the whole range of services you can imagine is covered by the positive list. On the other side, there is the UAE government has also issued a negative list which reflects certain activities which will not be allowed under the foreign direct investment law. What means that a foreigner who owns 100% in a company in the mainland of the UAE will not be allowed to conduct the activities which are reflected in the negative list. These are activities with the government of the UAE says with a strategic impact. Yeah, what can be more?
Strategic impact, I need to say also, especially now if you consider this this webinar today, it's more like oil and gas companies, I would say again, yeah. So I would not say that this is a requirement which should be applicable for the hearers today. So strategic impact might be, as I said, more oil and gas or.
Exactly, it's oil and gas sector, for example. It's it can be the manpower provider sector. It can be banking and insurance sector, and also financial sector, and the fisherman sector as well, which is dedicated or determined for the UAE nationals. Yeah, then we'll discuss briefly the value-added tax. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they have implemented the VAT in January 2018. Other countries followed then in 2019 and 20, such as Bahrain and Oman. Kuwait and Qatar, for example, they did not yet implement the value-added tax. The standard rate of the VAT is just 5% as per the GCC framework agreement. However, for example, Saudi Arabia, they have increased the value-added tax rate to 15% in July 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are rumors that once the pandemic is over, they will again bring it back to 5%. The UAE has not increased the VAT, so it's still 5% as date of implementation. The VAT system is, amongst others, based on the European VAT model. A tax authority, here the Federal Tax Authority, has been established in 2016, which is of course granted with comprehensive powers by law. There is within the GCC states a common legal framework agreement with regards to the value-added tax. So the basic principles of the value-added tax which shall apply in the respective countries and the GCC countries are reflected in the GCC framework agreement. There is, of course, a VAT law, executive regulations, and a tax procedure law. You are required, as a local company established in the UAE, you are required to register with the Federal Tax Authority in case you are exceeding a certain taxable turnover. And the VAT law distinguishes between the mandatory registration and a voluntary registration. As mentioned earlier, the standard rate is only 5%. This is a taxable supply, which applies, and the rate applies to all taxable services and goods which are supplied. It's called the standard rate. And the input tax is, of course, deductible. This is similar to the European VAT model, of course. On the other hand, we have zero-rated supplies. These are also taxable supplies, which are to be taxed at a rate of 0, and which applies to certain services and goods, for example, to services and goods coming from the health sector, healthcare sector. Then we have exempted supplies. So these are supplies which are exempted by law, for example, the supply of bare land or local transportation, or even out-of-scope supplies. So a supply from a VAT perspective is out of scope when the place of supply is not identified in the UAE. If you reach a taxable turnover of 187,500 dirham, but less than 375,000 dirham over a period of 12 months, you are eligible to register for VAT purposes as a local company. If you exceed the threshold of 375,000 dirham over the last 12 months, you have to register for VAT purposes. Below the 187,500 dirhams, you are not eligible to register for VAT purposes, so the tax authority would not grant you with a tax identification number. However, if you are a foreign company providing taxable supplies of services or goods in the UAE, but the tax liability cannot be transferred to the customer, you would be liable to register immediately if you reach, for example, only 1 dirham of taxable turnover in the UAE. So for foreign companies, the threshold of approximately 80,000 US dollar does not apply. So this is something what you need to take, what you need to keep in mind if you have already business in the UAE. One further crucial point is, in case you have a distribution agreement already in place with a local agent, this may cause or may create a permanent establishment from a VAT perspective in the UAE. So here it is also crucial to see whether you have a tax liability in the UAE or not.
I mean, here we just listed a few industries which from our point of view definitely have great potential in the UAE, in particular also related to the Expo 2020, actually, Omar. Yeah, it's still named to Expo 2020. So especially healthcare services and related products, construction, design, water-based telecommunication. This is just to mention and to give you an overview about the sectors which will be really requested and required during Expo and also further ongoing, which we can see there is a huge need also of foreign direct investments. Just let me briefly also say a few words about Rudl & Partner in Dubai and GCC. I don't want you to bother too much. We will definitely share the presentation later on with you, so you can go through also the last slides. It's, I think, worth mentioning that we have currently in the UAE our headquarters in Dubai, but latest beginning of 2022, Rudl & Partner will also have an own establishment in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, which will be under the umbrella of the UAE office. The reason for that is that we see more and more clients also going to Saudi Arabia. Maybe later on, or even currently, this would be also of interest for you. I also put 1-2 slides that you see in which areas we are working. We have a really great team of tax and law experts, also Arabic speaking lawyers and tax experts, which is crucial for the market. And of course, Omar, as Italian-speaking law and tax expert, who would be also always there for questions later on, or also in the meanwhile. So, and as I said, you can gladly go through the presentation, have an idea in which fields we are working in the UAE and GCC region. I also put a few references for your knowledge. And then on the last slide, of course, our contact details, but you can also reach us anytime through our colleagues in the Italian offices. Thank you very much.